In the single month of September 1993, 30 years ago, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints excommunicated or disciplined 6 of its members. These 6 individuals, some of them intellectuals, some activists, and some both, were soon dubbed the September Six. In her new book, The September Six and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism, Sara M. Patterson challenges readers to think more deeply about the events of that month and the era in which they unfolded. Patterson argues that the clever, alliterative phrase September 6 masks our ability to see that what happened that month was part of a much broader, decades long cultural and theological debate over the nature of the church and its restoration narrative. This debate continues to echo in the church today, having lasting effects on the institution, its believers, and the broader culture. Our guest today is Sara Patterson to talk about this new book. She is a professor of theological studies and gender studies at Hanover College, where she holds the inaugural Barron Professorship in Social Justice Education. She is the author of multiple articles addressing the intersections of gender, sexuality, and religion. Her research also explores the intersections of religion, space, and material culture, a topic she most recently explored in Pioneers in the Attic, Place and Memory Along the Mormon Trail. She is a former board member of the Mormon History Association. Sara Patterson, welcome to the Signature Books podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We're so excited to be talking with you about this incredible book that you've written. Maybe we could start by having you just kind of explain to our listeners and our viewers what exactly is the September 6th for anyone under 50 today, which is kind of remarkable to me. Anyone under 50 will probably not remember this month in September 1993. So for those of us who do remember, or those of us who are too young to remember, can you tell us a little bit more about what is this? What is the September 6th?
The September 6 were a group of scholars and feminists who were excommunicated or disfellowshipped from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in September 1993. And I'm not exactly sure what the origin of that phrase was, but a number of people told me that Lavina Fielding Anderson was the originator of the term. But I think that part of
And Lavina was, of course, one of those 6.
Yes, thank you. I think part of the reason that the term became so popular was that it was a really kind of scary time for people. People who weren't members of the church hierarchy didn't know exactly why things were happening, and they also didn't know what the extent of what was happening would be. As I was researching for the book, I interviewed with David Wright, who is a biblical scholar, excommunicated about 6 months after September 1993. And one of the things that he talked about, he believes that he was probably on the list to be excommunicated that month. But for a number of reasons, it didn't happen for another half a year. But one of the things that he talked about was just how much he didn't want it to happen, but also how he didn't know how to stop it, that nobody really understood, as I said, the extent to which it would go. And so I think sometimes the September 6th, that phrase kind of became popular because people wanted to limit the sense of just how chaotic it felt to people.
Right. And you point out in your book, it's a very clever alliteration, September 6th, and so much so that it is still sticks in our minds today. And that's the title of the book, because many people who do remember this time will identify, oh, I know what the September 6th was, right? And we're releasing the book on the 30th anniversary of September 1993. But again, you make an argument that despite that clever alliteration, it really wasn't just about 1 month, and it really wasn't just about 6 people. So can you explain that argument for us a little bit?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I think that that phrase is tied to people's desires to place limitations around what happened early on, to give people a sense that um, what happened wouldn't be widespread. But I think also that once we start thinking historically about a time, um, we can use phrases like September 6th to just be a quick shorthand way of communicating with each other. And I think that when we do that, we lose some of our ability to see the larger context. We put brackets around something, and then we only can see what's inside of the frame, and we're not able as easily to connect it to things that are outside of the frame. And so in the book, I try to make those connections. I think that we need to include the excommunications of people like David Wright and Brent Metcalf, or the disciplining of faculty at BYU, like Cecilia Conquer Farr, or the choice.
You even go as far back to talk about Sonia Johnson's excommunication
I do.
for her supporting the ERA and her outspokenness about supporting the ERA.
Yeah, I think that all of those are part of the same set of impulses within the church hierarchy, and that if we don't include them, then we only get a piece of the picture.
That's right. And I think that's a great argument that your book makes. And I think with this 30-year retrospective, it'll help people kind of make sense more of what was going on and understand what was in the minds of the dissenters. Your book does a great job of helping us understand that, as well as what was going on in the minds and the motives of the church hierarchy.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about that? What were the motivations behind the church hierarchy that you felt influenced these decisions?
So, what I argue is that the church was in the midst of globalizing, and church leaders were trying to be a force holding the church together in the face of what they felt was overwhelming growth and diversity. And so I think that they grasped onto the idea of a doctrinal core in the face of what felt like an exciting time because the church was expanding rapidly, but also a time that felt like there was the possibility that the church might be diluted or might move away from what they thought it ought to be. And so I argue that in that kind of grasping at a core, the church was setting up a purity system, and that the emphasis on purity kind of helped them feel like they had a sense of control over what was happening. And so I argue that the purity system had three pillars. Um, One was a doctrinal purity. So that aspect of purity emphasized the importance of orthodoxy or right thinking. And during that time, during the late 20th century, the church created its own intellectual culture that stood apart from mainstream academia and emphasized sources of knowledge that were distinct. The
What
second,
do you mean by that? What kinds of sources that were distinct? What does that mean?
I, at BYU in particular, scholars were told that they needed to emphasize revelation over reason, and that it was important, especially in history telling, to make sure that God's work in history was at the forefront of the story. And so that was really a distinct way of history telling when compared to the history telling that was taking place um, in the broader academic world, where there was a movement towards social history and telling history from the perspective of um, regular people rather than people with power and authority. And so there were during this time a number of clashes over history telling, and part of the reason was the church was wanting historians to emphasize a church narrative that was about the heroism of church leaders and about God's work in history.
Yeah, and then at about the same time, this is the era when you have a lot of professionally trained historians, PhD historians, and scholars who started working for the church in the church history department and telling church history in a different way. I'm thinking of course, Leonard Arrington and D. Michael Quinn, who was one of the September 6, and you talk about them in your book as well. So great. So that's doctrinal purity, and from the church. Leader standpoint, I do remember Elder Boyd K. Packer of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles talking about the need to keep the doctrine pure. So I remember that was very much part of the conversation at the time. So, okay, what are the other two pillars that you
Yeah,
argue
and
are
I would
part of the
just add
purity system?
there was a statement by the church hierarchy in October of 1993, kind of explaining not much of an explanation, but saying that church leaders were charged with overseeing the doctrinal purity of the church, and so for them that was a really important idea, and it was from their perspective a God-given task. Um, the second pillar of the purity system is the familial purity, and in it the church emphasized the value of the family as the basic unit to both its theological and social frameworks. And within that understanding of the family, relationships and roles were really rigid. So, a heterosexual monogamous temple marriage between a male priesthood holder and a wife who fulfilled the role of mother was set up as the ideal. And the church hierarchy at the time viewed feminism as an external social movement that was trying to upset um, what they talked about as a very stable understanding of the family. Um,
And perhaps without an understanding of there is a rich history of it wasn't called feminism in the 19th century. That word didn't quite exist yet, but there is this rich history of women's rights advocacy from Emmeline B. Wells, for example, who for decades was General Relief Society president for the church. So it's to me it's sad that there wasn't that understanding of how we do have a rich history of what we call feminism today in the church before the late 20th century.
and that was a history that um, church leaders weren't interested in telling at the time. Um,
I wonder if they even knew about it, to be honest.
yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, And then just to round it out, the third pillar of the purity system was about bodily purity, which focused on believers' bodies. And I argue in particular the male priesthood holder's body. And so a lot of purity cultures in the late 20th century were focused on women's bodies. But I am arguing that in the LDS church, the male body was a particular concern. And there was a lot of talk about the possible pollution of the male body, especially with same sex sexual acts. And the way it was framed was that the individual priesthood holder's body, if it was polluted, would also pollute the church as a body. And so there were a number of church leaders, Spencer Kimball comes to mind, who were
Yeah,
concerned.
president of the church in the
Yes, thank
70s and
you.
80s. Yeah. Mhm.
Were particularly concerned about the sexual activities of believers. Um,
Mhm.
but I think that this three pillar system meant that um, purity was a concern in every aspect of a believer's life, because there was the kind of institutional doctrinal purity, but then also the purity of the home and the purity of the body. So it was, um, yeah, just as I said, a part of everyday life.
These are such fascinating insights, and I loved reading your book, especially because you're not a Latter day Saint historian. You're not Latter day Saint, but yet you're a historian of Mormonism, Mormon history. And so you come at this from a perspective as a scholar rather than someone who's an insider in any way, but just looking at it as a scholar. Can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to write a book about Mormonism and why you do studies in Mormonism. We've served together on the board of directors of the Mormon History Association, so you've been involved with Mormon history. You've written books, a prior book about Mormon history. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what led you to end up writing this book?
Sure. In graduate school, I started studying Joseph Smith and just became fascinated with his story and the restoration movement. And it's something that I've never stopped being being fascinated with. And so it's been one of the movements that I study. My specialization is in American religious history, and so to me, um, Mormonism is a really important part of that history and can tell us a lot about religion in the United States. So that's why it's always been fascinating to me. Um,
What have you found? So going a little bit off topic here, but what have you found that Mormonism has taught you? What have you learned about religion in the United States through studying Mormonism?
I think that one of the um, issues that's talked about a lot in the history of Mormonism, and especially in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is that tension between um, initially being um, socially, economically punished for being too different from their Protestant peers. And then the church moving to assimilate after giving up the practice of plural marriage. Um, and the question of how much the institution should become like other religious institutions in the culture, trying to uh, maintain that distinction, but also wanting to be at the center of the culture. And I think that that comes out in this book in my discussion about how the church worked to share a platform with the religious right. And I think that the theology of the family and the family proclamation really helped the church um, argue that it had common cause with conservative evangelical Christians. And I was
Right?
really
Can you talk a little bit about what the family proclamation was for our listeners who may not know?
sure. It was a statement issued in 1995 um, by Gordon Hinckley when he was prophet. And it was in part putting into a very simple document the church's theology of the family. But it was also part of a larger project that where church leaders had been talking about how to, and this is tied again to the church's attempts to align itself with the religious right. Um, Dallin Oaks had at least a decade earlier made the argument that the church needed a document that showed the centrality of heterosexual marriage to its theology, and that
Yeah, and
the church,
Dallin Oaks being a former justice in Utah, an attorney, and then later an apostle in the
yes,
church. Yeah.
thank you for always reminding me not to assume that people know the names I'm talking about. He had argued that the church needed a document like that so that it could join in amicus briefs against any moves towards legalizing same-sex marriage. And so I think that there's the theology of the family proclamation, but that it also served a political function, and the political function was to show that the church would be in support of particular understandings of what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman, and then also that the church um, was setting itself up to legally fight for the preservation of heterosexual marriage as the only acceptable form of marriage.
Right. And I think it very much upholds what your argument about the three pillars about doctrinal, familial, and bodily purity. It lays out in very gendered terms the roles of women, the roles of men, and again, supporting this purity system that you argue existed and still exists today.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's get back to the book September 6th. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, it's always interesting when you're remembering back at things that things that happened and what led to various decisions you make in your life.
Yes.
But I kind of pinpoint about 2 years ago, Ben Park invited me to be part of a conference about Michael Quinn, who was one
And
of
who is Ben Park?
Ben Park is a history professor at Sam Houston University.
Sam Houston State, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and a Mormon historian, yeah.
And so he invited me to be part of a conference about Mike Quinn and his legacy, and I was really excited to do that because I had met Quinn a couple of times in graduate school, and two things. First of all, he was just such a welcoming and warm person to new scholars, which is not always what you experience from um, older and more established historians. And I also think that his story um, about being excommunicated for his history telling served as a reminder about kind of the stakes of telling history. Um,
Right, and of course, he was one of the September 6 who
yeah,
was executed, yeah.
that history telling is not a neutral activity, but that it's it comes from a particular place and it supports various narratives. And so I was excited to be part of that conference. And after reading a lot more about his experiences, one of the things that part of what I argued in my paper was that um, the church has a very particular narrative about how individual believers' lives should go. That's focused very much on what we were just talking about, a very gendered understanding of family with the goal of having children. And that the way that people even today narrate Quinn's life is that he was following that path, following the rules well, that he was on this upward trajectory, and that then when he chose to come out as a gay man, um, that his life turned kind of to a story of decline and a series of losses. The loss of his nuclear family, the loss of his position at BYU, which he resigned, but then wasn't able to find another long-term position in academia, and so the loss of his economic stability and
And the loss of his church membership,
loss
which
of
he
church
deeply
membership
mourned.
and loss of
Mhm.
community. And
Yeah,
while I don't want to suggest that those things were not losses in his life, I think it does him an injustice to say that his life turned to a series of losses, because he absolutely maintained um, family with his ex-wife and with his children, and he maintained community. He While he was being excommunicated, he was in California, going to an affirmation meeting. An affirmation
speaking there,
is,
right? A
yeah,
keynote speaker, I believe,
right.
yeah.
And so he was creating community, maybe not with the church members he had community with before, but he was creating community with LGBT, Latter Day Saints and ex Mormons, and he was able to he had a freedom to ask questions in his research that he hadn't had before, because his history telling needed to be approved at one level or another by the church hierarchy. And so I think to narrate his life as a series of losses is to do him an injustice. And so that's part of what I was talking about at the conference. Um, and I just
And
really
let me
enjoyed.
point out real quick let me point out real quick, Sarah, that your essay, your excellent presentation, your essay, as well as essays of all of those who spoke at that conference, have been preserved in a book published by Signature Books titled DNA Mormon Perspectives on the Life of Historian D. Michael Quinn. So any of our listeners who would like to read that
There are
can do so.
fantastic essays in that book. Um, and so then, Barbara, you come into the story because you invited me to write this book about the September 6th. And I think that the Quinn Conference had just primed me to want to do that. It's a time period that I've always been interested in, but I think that um, having done research on Quinn, I felt really excited to take this project on.
Well, I was so excited when you accepted that invitation to write a book, a 30-year retrospective on the September 6th for Signature Books. And we're so excited that it's being released this month. Listeners can go and pre-order it right now. Its official release date is September 25th. And again, we'll talk at the end about when you'll be speaking in Utah so people can come and meet you, have you sign their books, and ask more questions. I thought you were the perfect person, Sarah, to write this book. I wanted someone to approach this 30th anniversary from a scholarly perspective, which of course you are. You're established, amazing historian. And I wanted someone to be able to write about it, that someone who didn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, someone that didn't have an agenda, not an axe to grind, and someone, I don't know if you even ever heard about what was going on in 1993 with these excommunications, um, but someone who could just come at it from an outsider scholarly perspective, look at all the sources, and then come up with these arguments.
Um, so, can I talk a little bit about what I argue about the September 6th themselves and the other
Please,
dissenters?
please,
Because
yes.
I see them as part of a larger community of dissent within the church. And I think that one of the strengths of the six and others was the building of community. I think that they created a community, a support network of people who felt comfortable asking questions, and wanted the church to, um, believed that questions and dissent could help move the church in a positive direction. And so I think the six weren't the only ones. And it wasn't just individuals, it was also groups like Sunstone, who were creating spaces where people could ask questions and offer critiques. Um, but I would also add that um, this wasn't a movement. There wasn't somebody orchestrating from the top. People were offering their questions and concerns from an individual perspective. So it wasn't ever a unified um, uh, movement of dissent. But I do think that there were some similarities in the types of things they were saying. One of the things they were saying was that questions and dissent are important. And they were also, I think, observing what they saw in the church hierarchy as a movement to claim infallibility around church leaders at the top. And they were concerned about that and asking questions about that, and whether or not seeing church leaders as infallible was a helpful way for believers to see them. And they turned to history to talk about that. So they looked at past church leaders and um, the theologies that they offered, and raise questions about. They wanted to emphasize the humanity of church leaders. So I think that was another component of what they were trying to do. And I'm also arguing in the book that they offered an alternative vision of the restoration to the purity system that the church hierarchy was arguing for. Um, they were talking about God um, not as a being who was concerned with following rules and kind of binding yourself to people higher up in the hierarchy. They argued that God wanted an egalitarian community, and that um, God was concerned with the search for truth, and God was concerned about creating an inclusive community on earth. Um, they also argued that um, personal experiences like the personal revelation, the movement of the Spirit, were important sites of authority. And so they were arguing that there were more sites of religious authority than just the teachings of the church hierarchy.
Your concluding chapter of the book takes a look at where we are today, 30 years after the September 6th.
Yeah.
What are your conclusions? How has the church changed? How have things changed in general? How have they stayed the same?
I'll start with how they've stayed the same, if that's all right. Um, I think that um, I think that there's still a lot of evidence that the purity system is alive and well in the church and in the church hierarchy. I think what's happening on the BYU campuses as an example of where we can see the purity system at work. Um,
What do you mean by that, Sarah?
yeah.
How do you see?
Recently, the church education system changed the honor code for the BYUs. And the new language suggested that any same sex relationships and physical intimacy would be treated as immoral conduct. Um, in addition, in order to receive the ecclesiastical endorsement from their bishop that's necessary for a student to be a student at the BYUs, there are a series of questions that potential students will be asked. And those questions, in part, are tied to the church's stance on chastity and tithing and abstinence, um, but also ask potential students, if they support any teachings that are contrary to what the church teaches. And so that's coming on several years of asking similar questions of potential employees at the BYUs. And so I think, I initially saw that work to ask employees to say that they agreed with the church's teachings about family and marriage.
And by employees, you mean professors and staff members
Yes,
at the three
yes,
Brigham Young
professors and
universities.
staff members. Um, in the book, I talk about that as an attempt to ensure that in the future there aren't Mike Quinns or Cecilia Conker-Fars or David Wrights who become faculty at BYU. And I still think that that's true. And now to see that process trickling to students as well, I think is a real attempt to um, keep dissent off of a college campus, which I think is um, is a powerful statement about how important the idea of purity is.
So you see this manifesting itself most strongly at the universities owned and run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day
I
Saints,
do.
is what I hear you saying.
do. Um, I think that while the purity system is still alive and well, I think there are lots of ways that dissent, that the tradition set forth by the September 6th and other dissenters is still happening. And part of what the research that Jana Reese has done has shown is that um, younger generations are willing to leave churches that don't hold the same perspective and teachings about sexuality and family that they hold.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think you're talking about Jana Reese's book, The Next
I
Mormons,
am,
how millennials are changing the future of the church. Yeah.
yeah. And there's a lot of research about how Gen Z is just looking more for a spirituality that makes sense to them individually, and is much more willing to critique institutions that don't align with their moral compass. So I think that while the impulse to maintain purity is very much alive in the church hierarchy, I think that people in the pews are really pushing back in a lot of different ways. And some of those
Okay.
ways is
That's
just
how you
believing.
Yeah, so that's how you see the change, what's different 30 years
Yes.
later. What about the church's, willingness to tell, truth telling, talking about its history? How have you seen that changed over the last
Well, I think with the rise of the internet and people's access to historical documents and just access to information, the church has taken uh, a much a much different stance towards history telling. The institution um, can't can't control its ability to be the only history teller in people's lives. And so instead, the church is working really hard to um, offer narratives that tell the history from a faithful perspective, but also try to reckon with some of the more controversial aspects of that history.
Yeah.
And the church has also been much more open, is opening up more in terms of document access, and also publishing documents that in past decades wouldn't have come to light.
Yeah, as a former, employee of the church history department, I can say that I've certainly seen that in my own, life, and, just an example, I write about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and just the openness and the willingness to just come forward and talk about these difficult topics in church history, shows progress. And most of those who work in the church history department today are PhD historians. They're professional trained historians. Whereas before, professionally trained historians, like in the 1970s when they first started, we were talking earlier about Leonard Arrington, D. Michael Quinn, and others. That was kind of frowned upon, but now it's much more of the mainstream. So, yeah, I see that progress as well, that change in that way. So, um, last question. Is there anything you've learned about Mormonism by studying 20th century history, this story that you didn't know about before? Any surprises, any new insights that came to you?
Um, I think when I think about what stood out to me the most in the research, it was the similarities in many of the stories I heard of how individual women in the church came to their feminism. And I knew that the church portrayed feminism as an external force trying to infiltrate the institution, and I knew that that wasn't correct. But it was really um, it was really helpful for me to hear individual stories that so often talked about women who in their youth were taught that their voices were important and that their spiritual lives mattered and that they could speak with religious authority, that they were an integral part of the community, um, who then grew up and felt like they were told that there were limitations, that there were limitations because they were women. And I think that that set of contradictions in their lives was really striking to me. I think that um, while I didn't think that feminism was an external force, I also hadn't understood just how much their experiences within the church, the contradictory messages that they received in the church, were the site of their um, coming to feminism.
Yeah, that was really striking to me too. And I remember when I read that chapter, I certainly related to it very much as a Latter-day Saint woman myself. Sara Patterson, thank you so much for joining us today on the Signature Books podcast. We are so excited for you to be visiting Utah in person October 4th through the 7th this year. She will be speaking, folks, on October 5th at the Salt Lake City Library, Thursday evening, October 5th, Salt Lake City Main Library. She will have books there and for signing. And then she'll be speaking again on Saturday night, October 7th at Written Vision Bookstore in Provo. So we invite you to join us there. We will put the details about that in the show notes and invite you to come and meet Sara in person and ask your questions of her in person. Sara, thank you so much for your work on this important subject. And we're so honored to have you as a signature author.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks for tuning in for the Signature Books podcast, a member of the Dialogue Podcast Network. If you'd like to listen to another great podcast on the subject, check out the September 8th Dialogue Journal podcast titled Contemporary Perspectives on the September 6th, 30 Years On. And finally, if you'd like to hear Sara Patterson speak in person about the September 6th and the struggle for the soul of Mormonism, please join us at the Salt Lake City Downtown Library at 7 p.m. on October 5th or at Written Vision in Provo at 6 p.m. on October 7th, 2023. We hope to see you there.